Buongiorno, benvenute e benvenuti a tutti per questa Padua Nobel Lecture 2018 dedicata quest'anno all'economia e con la presenza eccezionale del premio Nobel, professor Michael Spence. Vorrei fargli un applauso di benvenuto perché siamo veramente felici che sia qui. C'è un pubblico in sala, ma c'è anche un pubblico in streaming su Facebook e YouTube che ci sta seguendo. Un saluto anche a loro. Io curo questo evento per il palinsesto di attività culturali e di comunicazione del sapere che si chiama Universa. E la Padua Nobel Lecture è un evento che noi facciamo all'inizio, o vicino all'inizio dell'anno accademico, per celebrare l'inizio delle lezioni, ma anche per celebrare eccellenze nel mondo della scienza e del sapere. L'eccellenza di quest'anno è Michael Spence, che verrà presentato dal professor Bruno Maria Parigi. Ci donerà una lezione dedicata, come vedete, alla Transformation of the Global Economy. Seguirà poi un dibattito condotto da Eleonora Di Maria e dallo stesso professor Parigi e dedicheremo poi un po' di tempo alle domande dal pubblico, quindi ci sarà una Q&A session. Siamo tutti in attesa di sentire il professor Spence, ma prima invito il professor Rosario Rizzuto, rettore di questa università, per un saluto istituzionale. Grazie e buon evento.
È un ospite americano, quindi il saluto, come tutta la lettura, lo farò in inglese. So, dear colleagues, dear students, Professor Spence, it's a great privilege and pleasure to welcome you in our university. Of course, as you heard from Annalisa, it's a great opportunity to have a Nobel awardee to deliver a lecture in our main room, in our Aula Magna. But let me tell you that it is a special pleasure to have Professor Spence to deliver a lecture here. Not only because it's a lecture on economy and an intelligent view of economical systems, but because, let me be a bit brave, I think Professor Spence should feel at home in this room and should feel at home in what this room and this university represents. And this is because our colleagues of the business faculty told me, but you know, you're not an economist, so how much do you know about economy? And which is absolutely true, I mean, I must say. But economy is our life and our daily life. And I like very much the idea that what I understood of the success of Professor Spence are two fundamental concepts which I like very much. The first is that in economy, but in science, you must dare. You must dare to think differently from mainstream ideas. You must dare to analyze with a new vision established concepts. And the idea that markets were perfect and everything new, everything in markets was the concept of economy. And he dared to break this knowledge and to say that there is an asymmetry in knowledge, and this is a fundamental driver. And so by daring to attack an established knowledge, I think he gave to my knowledge as non-economist, but a very, very important contribution in our understanding of where our society is going, because economy is society. And for this reason, in this room where we have Galileo looking at us, and no, Galileo is there. Here is Morgagni, which is also that has been a very innovative. He changed medicine. He changed the idea that you don't look at things, but you explore things. So in this university that has been a leader in the concept of the scientific method, in looking and experimenting and daring to tackle established knowledge, I think you should feel at home. And the second, that the message is particularly important. It is particularly important for societies and for university, which is knowledge is value. That if you invest in understanding, if you know something, you have an advantage. And therefore, it is not a waste of time to know. It is not a waste of time to investigate, because this is also, even in economy where everything becomes, the solid part of society, even there, knowledge has a substantial value. So for this reason, I think we are all very, very keen to listen directly from him, his discovery and his thoughts about it today. But I think that we are very proud to have you here, and I really think that you, and hope that you will feel at home in the university. Welcome.
Good morning. It's a great honor for me to introduce Professor Spence. I'm going to say a few words about his contribution to economics and why they matter for a university like ours. So Michael Spence, together with a handful of other economists, in the 70s has revolutionized the way we think about economics. These economists brought to the forefront of economic analysis the very notion of information. When I started studying economics in the middle of the 70s, the textbooks barely mentioned the word information. Information didn't matter for economists, and when it mattered, everybody was taught to have the right amount of information. The basic insight of Spence and of the two other economists that shared the 2001 Nobel Prize with him in economics was instead to focus on the idea that information is not distributed evenly among economic actors. Rather, some agents know things that others don't know. We call it asymmetric information. And to convey credibly this information to the others, one may have to undertake actions which are going to be costly. Spence is probably most famous for his job market signaling model, which has triggered an enormous volume of literature with applications to education, finance, industrial organization, just to mention a few fields. But since we are in a university, let me briefly focus on the application of the signaling model to education. So the idea is that the ability, the skills, if you wish, of a person that looks for a job are better known to the individual than to the potential employers. So the job seekers are going to signal their respective skills to the employers by acquiring a certain degree, a certain level of education. Now, why would this work? Well, because acquiring education requires lots of effort, spending long hours, evening and weekends in the library or in a laboratory to finish an assignment. However, it is plausible to think, and this is the crucial step, that the cost to acquire additional education is lower for people with higher ability. So the employers are going to pay higher wages to more educated employees because they know that the proportion of employees with higher ability is higher among the educated ones. Now, if you push the argument a little bit further, for the model to work, it's not even necessary for education to have any intrinsic value. In the sense, if education can just convey information about the sender, which is the potential employee, to the recipient, which is the employer, and if the signal is costly. Now, this helps explain why, under certain conditions, we may end up over-investing in education, which means higher ability individuals are going to acquire more education than necessary, precisely to discourage less able individuals from trying to imitate them and to signal employers how smart they are. In general, the basic idea of the model is extremely powerful because it helps explain why we undertake seemingly wasteful actions. Now, I cannot resist drawing a parallel between this very elegant construction that signals, that is based on the signaling value of education, and the coats of arms that hangs from the walls in this room. Now, as we know, they are the coats of arms of the professors and the students of the University of Padova that until the end of the 17th century had the privilege of leaving a mark of distinction on the walls of the university. Indeed, the students back then, and still now, were very proud to belong to the university and wanted to signal not only that they had studied, but that they had studied here in Padova, and they wanted to do it in a most conspicuous and visible way. So these coats of arms that you get to see are one of the visible proofs of the signaling value of education. Now, the topic of today's lecture of Professor Pensa, the transformation of the global economy, is only apparently unrelated to the value of education. Indeed, it becomes more and more clear that education, and more generally, human capital, is the main source of prosperity of individuals, countries, and entire continents. Furthermore, education is a key ingredient not only to adapt to the transformations that lie ahead, but to lead these transformations. I am going to stop here, and without further delay, I'm going to leave the floor to Professor Spence.
Well, good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. It must be a great privilege to study in a university with this history and record of accomplishment. But I have to tell you, when I walked in, I thought I was in an art gallery in a museum, not a university. It's quite extraordinary. So I put up the coat of arms of the university and Galileo. Studied a little bit about the university, but I have a lot to learn. I really appreciate the warm welcome and the warm introduction, and we don't have a lot of time this morning, and this is a rather comprehensive subject, so let me tell you where I'm trying to go. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on history, because I don't think you understand change easily without knowing kind of how we got here. But I'll end up arguing that we're in the midst of a fairly major transformation that's going to be and feel different than what the world felt like for the post-war period, which is, roughly speaking, my lifetime. I was born during World War II, 1943. So that's where I want to go. But let me say a couple of things by way of introduction. First of all, this is about dynamics, change, and so on. Economics, for all its strengths, is still not very good at building models of transitions. We build models of equilibria. We take wild guesses as to what happens when we're shifting between equilibria, but we don't really have good models of how these changes occur. But they do occur, and people in policy-making positions and so on have to manage in that environment. I would describe it as aided to some extent by conceptual models, but largely an art rather than a science at this stage in life. So I wrote a book called The Next Convergence, and it was an attempt to understand the growth in the developing countries. But let me go back a little before that. So the person who does this work, or has done it and illuminated the economic growth over the centuries, is Angus Maddison. And this is a picture of economic growth. Now, you might think that up until the 18th century, looking at that graph, that nothing happened. Actually, that's not true. A lot of things happened. There was trade in the Mediterranean and spreading out to Asia and Northern Europe. The Italian city-states were the driving force in that, and those were important areas of innovation. I actually wrote one of my 2 papers as a PhD student on the long-distance trade that was managed by the Italian city-states, including Venezia. And it was fascinating. I mean, in the course of this, they invented double-entry bookkeeping and a few other rather important things that are part of our life. But what happened in the 18th century was that all the science, and mathematics and other things that had developed before that got applied to economics. So this is a kind of technological revolution. It began in Britain, in the British Industrial Revolution. It spread to continental Europe fairly quickly. And you can see we have a kind of growth explosion. This is my favorite graph of all time. It comes from Robert Fogel, the late Robert Fogel, famous economic historian. And what it does is track not the economy, but the population of the world. And while it's very hard for you to read probably at that distance, it also mentions really important innovations. And the point of all this is just that we're in a completely different period than what we were in for most of the recorded history, or the history we know much about, and it's been driven by science, medicine, engineering, technology, and so on. So what is this next convergence? So I'm going to do this briefly. So what happened, and so if you go back to the pre-18th century period and looked across the globe, the population was obviously much smaller. But more than that, there weren't that big, the differences between continents and countries weren't all that great. Most people think, to the extent we can measure it, that the Ming Dynasty in China, roughly 15th, 16th century, was, you can turn that off, or I'll kill it, was more prosperous than continental Europe. But basically everybody was, by our standards, poor. And what happened, starting with the British Industrial Revolution, is we had 200 years of growth that we'd never seen before. And it wasn't just growth in economies, it was growth in per capita incomes. That is, things that change your lives. But that growth occurred in what we now call the developed economies, which is, I mean, in very rough numbers, 15% of the world's population. The other 85% stayed more or less exactly where they were. And that went on for 200 years. And while those growth rates weren't breathtakingly high, if you do it for 200 years, it makes a fairly big difference. It produced an enormous gap between the way we lived in, North America or Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and a few other outlying places, and the developing world, where 85% of the world's population lived. And it is in the post-war period that pattern broke down. Slowly, haltingly, in steps, but it broke down. And so the post-war period is the period that I call the convergence process, and we're in the middle of it now. And a fair amount of what I will say today has to do with one form or other of the impacts of all of that happening. But one conclusion is fairly clear, and that is, if you add the other 85% to the global economy, and over time they get richer and their incomes go up and their consumption of energy goes up, we're going to have a global economy that is orders of magnitude bigger than anybody who was, who lived in the pre-war period ever thought was possible, because people didn't believe that this kind of growth was going to occur. And why is it a post-war phenomenon? I think it's fairly easy to see. The early part of the 20th century was sort of a disaster. We started with World War I, which was a human disaster on all fronts. And then Germany had hyperinflation. The approach to the post-war period was to crush the people who lost the war. We got National Socialism, then we threw in a Great Depression, and then we went to war again. And then the long and the short of it is, a bunch of people, mostly in the developed economies, decided that that was an exercise that should not be repeated, and decided to go a different route. And they started to create institutions that were initially created to facilitate war recovery. So the Marshall Plan and the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs and the World Bank, which was originally called the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, were all created to do that. At the same time, the colonial empires collapsed, basically because the people who ran them couldn't afford it anymore. And so, for the first time, at least in principle, the developing countries had access on a pretty level playing field notwithstanding this enormous gap, to participating in what we now call the global economy. And that started a process that nobody really anticipated that has led to the growth we see today. And so this is a picture, just for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, of the global income distribution. And you can see that if you go way back to just 2003, it's still pretty concentrated. And that is, there's a lot of poor people, and then it spreads out. And as this graph gets flatter, as you move out in time, then you are starting to see the effect of the collapsing of the gap in the income between, on average, between the developed world and the developing world. So when I started working on these things 15 years ago, most of the developing world you would consider poor. Now most of the developing world, not all of it, but most of it is in what the category we call middle income. China's there, India's at the lower end of that. There are exceptions to that. There are poor countries, especially in Africa still, but even Africa has started to grow. So, skipping ahead, as this process went on over decades, and I don't have time to describe it in detail, but if you want to come, I teach a course on the subject. I'd be delighted to have any of you in it. As this process went along, the developing countries became larger. It may surprise you to know that they're well over half the global economy now. And some of them, like China, are really quite big. China is an economy that's roughly 75 to 80% the size of the United States economy or the European economy. Those two are about the same. And so, along with that growth comes influence and a desire to be part of the decision-making process. So the club that created and modified the architecture that I just described, that facilitated this, was the G7 or G8, depending on whether Russia had been in or kicked out again, was no longer a representative body. And so what happened is, in the post-2000 period, we moved over and we got the G20. Now the G20 is a club that includes about 85% of the world's GDP, output. It's about 66% of the world's population, but it's a mix of countries that are developing, emerging economies, so-called, and the developed economies. And that's supposed to be the mechanism that we've used to coordinate things. Later on in my talk, I'm going to tell you that's been a failure. Except for the immediate response to the great financial crisis that started in the United States in 2008, it hasn't been able to do anything. And so the architecture that facilitated this growth and this convergence process is starting to break down. And that's what I'll spend my time on in a little while. But while we were getting there, we had some stresses and strains along the way. So here's the picture. The blue line up here is the developed economies, and the red line is the emerging economies. And somewhere around the year 2011-12, this crossover point occurred. That's the top graph. And they will continue to grow and grow as a fraction. And on the bottom, you see contributions, for those of you who are interested in where the growth came from in the global economy. The answer is it's increasingly coming from the developed countries. I should have said that when the developing countries started to grow, they grew at rates we'd never seen before. The China growth rates for the first 35 years after it changed its economic model in 1978 was somewhere around 9.5%. I don't think most of you in this room have lived in an economy that's growing at 9.5%, but it changes so fast that it almost takes your breath away. It's also very chaotic. You know, when you sort of get down from the lofty heights of macroeconomics and look at it on the ground, industries come and go and all kinds of things happen that are challenges for individuals to manage. Economists, I think, as a group, we oversold globalization. We said it benefited everybody net-net. That wasn't quite right. probably, if you added up all the benefits and looked at these developing countries, unless you discount them, you'd surely agree with that. But we started to have adverse aspects of growth patterns in the post-war period. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I'd like you to see a few aspects of that. What do I mean by adverse aspects? I mean distribution, okay? For most of this period, people didn't take seriously in the way they do now the sustainability issues. So that's an additional dimension that needs to be addressed, and I'd be happy to talk about questions of that. They should have come up earlier, given the prospective size of the global economy. So this was work that was started at MIT. It has to do with technology. And what these graphs are is the following. If you take jobs and classify them in two ways, one is the standard one, white or blue collar. White collar ostensibly means use your head and your computer, and blue collar means, you know, you're making something, a worker. These folks use cognitive and manual, but you get the idea, and forget for a moment that most jobs have a mix of the two. And then they divided it between routine and non-routine. What does routine mean? Well, in the digital era, it's fairly easy to describe. Routine jobs are things that are repetitive in the sense that we know the steps that we can take, and in principle, we can code them, as in software, and then a machine can do them. And indeed, automation was starting in this process. And if you look at these graphs, what they tell you is that non-routine jobs, both white and blue collar, grew in the American economy. This applies to all economies, but I just have the data for America. And the routine jobs started drifting down, and then around the year 2000 started to drop like a stone. We are taking routine jobs out of the economy. And now I'm going to take an aside. And the reason people write about this so much is that there's been a breakthrough in artificial intelligence that I'll come to a little later, but roughly speaking, there weren't that many things that we could codify. We could codify filing, we could, codify a bunch of things, but there are many things that human beings do almost automatically that you can't write down the steps. So, for example, everybody in this room can recognize a chair, right? But there's an uncountable number of forms of chairs. And if you think about it for a moment, you don't know how you recognize a chair. You just learn to do it at some point. The same is true of language translation. The same is true of a whole bunch of things. So most people in artificial intelligence 10 years ago thought we'd hit a dead end. In fact, there was an alternative theory or set of concepts that had been developed before that involved neural networks and deep learning algorithms. But they weren't implementable because they require massive amounts of data, massive amounts of computing power, and high-speed networks to implement. But it turns out that machines can now learn to do things that we can do, but we can't describe how we do them. And probably the single most important one is image recognition. The machines now are increasingly recognizing images, and they don't do it by being told what the image is supposed to look like. They do it by looking at millions of images, every few seconds, and figuring it out by pattern recognition, by these learning algorithms. Now, you might say, well, I don't care about image recognition. Well, you should, okay? Because machines reading X-rays and MRI results, or autonomous cars have to see. Right? So image recognition turns out to be a kind of big, expensive engine, that turns out to have, thousands of applications, just like your ability to see turns out to have thousands of applications as you go through your day. Back to the growth patterns. The other thing we saw clearly happening, and this does have to do with both technology and globalization, is a phenomenon that has come to be called job and income polarization. And what it means, basically, is middle-income jobs are disappearing disproportionately from the economy, and the middle-income part of the income distribution is going down, and the tails are getting fatter. Okay, so if you think of an income distribution as looking like this, then what's happening is these tails are getting bigger and the middle's getting flatter. And that process, this is a graph that does it by category of work. Then the ones in the middle are production, people who are doing manufacturing type things on the factory floor and so on. And you can see this pattern fairly clearly. If you look across countries, these are mostly European countries, OECD countries. The green lines are low-paying jobs, so this is done in terms of income. The pink lines are middle-paying jobs, and the black ones are high-paying jobs. Never mind the precise definitions. And you can see that pretty much everywhere there's a pattern, a quite striking pattern of taking out the middle-income jobs. If you look at this is a phenomenon that's been going on now for probably somewhere between 30 and 40 years. If you look at the fraction of national income that goes to people who work, to labor, as opposed to the government or capital, those are the three places income can go, what you discover is that the labor share of income rose in the post-war period to about the end of the 1970s, and then it turned around, and it's becoming systematically down across OECD countries and so on. So you can see, regardless of which lens you pick, you can see that the growth patterns in the developed countries in this sort of globalizing world were starting to produce income and wealth inequality, problems with jobs, problems associated with self-esteem, associated with those jobs, and so on. Again, you can spend a lot of time studying this, and I want to assure you these aren't just a few observations. There's now tons and tons of research on this, although it took a while to get it out. The other thing that I've studied, so I'll just say this very quickly. So I asked myself the question, where do we actually create jobs in the American economy in the last 20 years, roughly speaking, roughly 20 years? And to do this, I had a co-author, very talented woman who's now at the IMF from South Africa originally. We took sector by sector, we divided the economy into tradable and non-tradable. Now, I know this is going to sound technical to you, but this is a really important difference, right? Tradable means internationally tradable. It means, in principle, somebody else can do it. Non-tradable means it has to be produced in the country in which it's consumed, right? So it's not directly vulnerable to international competition. To a first approximate, I usually try to embarrass people, but I won't try it today. So question, how big is the non-tradable sector in a modern economy? Answer, roughly 2/3. Okay, it's huge. Why? Because it has the government, it has the education sector, it has the military, it has construction, it has hotels, food, restaurant, retail, right, stores and stuff like that. It's gigantic. And so so that section, wasn't vulnerable. So if you look at the American economy over these roughly 20 years, what you discover is that all of the employment, net, was created in the non-tradable sector. So we didn't actually have an unemployment problem for the most part, but we did have a problem generating employment in the tradable sector. Well, what's in there? Well, there's two categories. There's manufacturing, pretty much all of it. That all declined. If you took another country like Germany, it would decline but less. It's a bigger part of the German economy, the industrial sector. But you see the same forces at work. The other part of the tradable economy is services, like consulting, like parts of finance, like managing multinational enterprises. I mean, pretty high-paying, high-powered stuff. And those grew. And when you netted it all out, you got zero, right? If you look at value added, which is an economist's way of keeping track of growth across sectors, you see a very different picture. The tradable sector is smaller. It's only a third of the economy, but it grew quite nicely. And if you then look at the value added per person employed, which is a crude measure of productivity, what you discover is that it went way up in the tradable sector and kind of flatlined in the non-tradable sector. So basically, we grew in both sectors. In the non-tradable sector, we used up the growth with employment, and in the tradable sector, we used it up by higher output per worker, and that, of course, then turns into income to somebody, right? Depends on the country you're in, disproportionately, it went to capital in the last little while. Now I'm going to show you video. This is, apologies if you've already seen this, but the automation, this is old automation, not AI-driven automation. And I hope the sound's off, because this can be pretty noisy. This one's, I apologize for this one, but I wanted you to see there's been a breakthrough in robotics as well. So the two critical things that have, three in robotics that have occurred. Oh, maybe I should play it while we're waiting. Yes. So this is actually an advertisement. Whoops. Oh, that didn't work. All right, we'll try this again. Yes. Well, we'll live with the sound. So the breakthroughs are vision, sensors, artificial intelligence systems for the image recognition business so it actually knows what it's seeing, and fine motor coordination. So robotics has been
The
around
lightweight
for a long
and
time
compact
in,
M1IA
automobile
Delta-style
plants,
robot
but
is an
those are
ideal
just
picking and material handling
mechanical
robot
things.
for
They do
operations that
riveting and
require
whatnot.
high
And
speed and
they're
accuracy.
insensitive to what's going on around them. If you send
This
power
video
down
demonstrates
the
the
assembly
superior
line, it's
capabilities
riveting,
of the
right? It
FANUC
doesn't know it's power.
M1IA
So
.5A
this
6-axis
is
robot
just,
equipped
so
with
it's
FANUC
doing something
IR vision
stupid,
and a
which is
color
picking up
camera
pills
as it picks and
accurately,
sorts
different
pills of
colors.
3
You can
different
see them,
colors.
at
First,
a
the
speed
robot
that
uses
humans
its
can't keep up.
6-axis
Can't do
articulation
in the
to
first
pour the
place, we
pills
can't
onto
keep
the
up. So
platform.
I'll let you see it once
Once the
again.
pills are completely poured out, the robot uses a 2D color IR vision camera to locate the 3 different types of pills. This monitor displays what the robot's camera is seeing. The robot then proceeds to pick and sort the pills by color
So
into
let me just
3
say,
different bottles.
So 10 years ago, robots couldn't do electronics assembly. It was all done by people, but you know, with the ability to see and fine motor skills. It now can do electronics assembly.
Once
It
all of the
thinks
pills
there's a
are
good
picked
chance
and
that the
sorted, the
labor-intensive
M1IA
processes
robot dumps the
for,
pills back onto the
electronics
platform,
assembly and maybe
and the cycle
things beyond
repeats.
that are going to be replaced by robotics because they
In
get
addition to
tired
this
of making
robot's high speed
mistakes,
and
etc.
accuracy, its linear
At least
rail
as the
mounting
journey
is
goes on.
significant in that it
This is a Philips manufacturing facility for electric razors. This one's in the Netherlands. At the time, this is about 5 years old. At the time this picture was taken, this plant had approximately the same overall cost characteristics as the labor-intensive plant outside of Shanghai. But the cost characteristics of the digital technologies are such that they keep going down. And so once it passes the labor-intensive one is gone. And that's just another example of what we're talking about. I talked about this. This is the old and the new AI. So the reason you see so much writing about this is the scope of things that in principle could be automated has increased dramatically. It's writing about the future because it hasn't happened yet, right? If it had happened, we wouldn't have declining productivity data in most economies. So it's all in the future and potential, but it is, you know, depending on your point of view, a little bit frightening. And it's quite extraordinary, the range of applications. So I just mentioned scanning magnetic resonance images, X-rays, skin cancers. I would say in the relatively near future, doctors and lawyers will have digital assistants, really powerful ones. I mean, think about a doctor. There's an enormous literature that comes out. To go back to your comments earlier about information, we can't handle it, right? But an artificial intelligence assistant can scan at light speed the literature in medicine, and with a small amount of guidance, pick off the stuff that a particular kind of doctor really need to see and read, right? That's just enormously powerful. Scanning, depending on your legal system, scanning case law is a natural for these things. And we're just at the start. We don't know where this is all going to go. This is an autonomous vehicle, happens to be a truck. For those of you who are interested, there's a very good book written by a man named Kai-Fu Lee on artificial intelligence. What I like about this book, other than he describes it, so in a way that you can understand it, but he also tells you something that many people forget to mention, which is there's a difference between something happening tomorrow and something happening 20 years from now, because it affects the amount of time we have individuals, organizations, societies have to adjust to it. And artificial intelligence in different categories is coming at us at different rates, right? So certain things are almost immediate. An autonomous vehicle in a structured environment, like an autostrada, is probably, we're getting close without having fatal mistakes being made. In an unstructured environment, we're a long way away, maybe probably 10, 15 years at least. In completely unstructured, in principle, there'll be a robot that does what your gardener does. What Kai-Fu Lee would say is that's the least likely to be automated. Completely unstructured environment, right? Have to detect shadows. Shadows are an enormous problem for image recognition and so on. So it's coming at us, but it's coming at us at a pace that, This is a friend of mine named James Manika. He's the head of chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute, which does a lot of research on jobs, on automation, on technology, and so on. This is image recognition. So a few years ago, these image recognition systems weren't all that good. They made errors 26% of the time when I try to identify a cheetah. That's a guepardo, I guess, in Italian. Humans make 5% errors, and the vision recognition image recognition systems have passed the humans. That's a fairly common pattern. With lip reading or almost anything, they're in the process of going past. I mentioned productivity, so a brief aside on productivity. If you've got all this technology around, that in principle, makes people so much more productive, why are the measured productivity levels going down in virtually all the developed countries? And the answer is complicated, and nobody knows what it is for sure. but the argument that there's a big difference between potential and implementation, I think, is right. So this is a very complex picture, but basically what it does, it's an attempt to measure the extent of digitization across sectors, in this case in the American economy. And you can see at the top, there's a few green sectors, technology and finance, where there's really advanced digitization. But most of the economy is sort of still has most of the work to do to take advantage of this. So the hypothesis is fairly straightforward. As that happens over time, and we almost always overestimate how fast these things happen, almost always. And then it looks like there will be a substantial productivity. So the argument is we're not seeing it because of lags, because people don't change their behavior very quickly, organizations don't restructure themselves overnight, and so on. We've seen this twice before. Once, in the 1980s, Bob Solow wrote a paper, Steve Roach wrote another one, and basically said, if we've got all these computers around, why haven't we got a measured productivity effect? It was perfect timing. And it was true, we didn't. We couldn't trace any productivity increases to computers and what was then digital technology. And then the internet arrived in the middle of the 1990s, and we had a kind of explosion of productivity for a while, some of which is still going on, but it's wearing off. This is probably a lag effect like that. I lived through the internet bubble in Silicon Valley, and I think we made the same mistake. The valuations weren't based on stupid ideas about what was going to happen. They just got the timing wrong, right? Tomorrow instead of 20 years from now. Okay, final set of comments. I'm going to try to convince you that much of what I've described, in part because of those growth patterns that we just talked about, is going to cause a breakdown and a re-architecting of the global system that we lived in. So you know we're in the midst of a trade war instigated by the United States and targeted mainly, mainly now at China, although we took a shot at Mexico and Canada. I got to tell you, I grew up in Canada, right? So I was stunned when the Americans went after Canada. Canada couldn't be more vulnerable, right? So on the northern boundary, 20% of the GDP is exported to the United States. I mean, the President of the United States held all the cards. It wasn't a negotiation, it was just a capitulation. But anyway, we've sorted that out with a revised version of NAFTA, and I suspect that one can be reasonably confident that whatever trade tensions that we have between North America and Europe will get sort of sorted out, because the big picture item is the rivalry with China. So one version of this trade war is that it isn't fun. It will adversely affect global growth. It will surely hurt Chinese growth for a while, a little less so maybe America in the direct sense, but it'll get settled and it will subside. So this argument basically runs in the direction of the architecture we have is fine. We just got some frictions and tensions to deal with, some of them internal to our own economies and societies, and some others outside. So the argument goes, President Trump won't last forever. The trust in government, which we've lost a fair amount of in the recent past, will be restored. Europe will get sorted out. We can talk about that. The emerging markets, which have had a bout of instability, not China and India, but Brazil, Turkey, and a number of others, that'll all get sorted out, and they'll restabilize. And this mountain of debt that we've created in the global economy since the great financial crisis, remember that was caused by debt, and we're delevering? No, we're not. We've added in gross debt in the global economy approximately an amount equal to the global GDP. Think of it as $75 trillion of gross debt. Not netted out, that's your asset and my liability, that stuff, but it's dangerous. And then we'll go back to some variant with modifications of the system that we've had all along. That seems to me is possible. Nobody has a crystal ball, but I don't think it's very likely. And so the main thing I want to leave you with is, with that history, and some of the problematic aspects of the growth patterns and the rise of the emerging economies, that we're going to actually live in a very different world, the outlines of which we can partly see, but the details of which, you can't know in advance. And so here's the argument, in brief. One, I think that the rivalry between China and the United States, why do I pick China and the United States? Because they're big, relatively homogeneous markets, and they're big, powerful economies. Now, in principle, you can imagine Europe being in this category, but it's going to have to go through a set of changes that make it A, more homogeneous as a market, and B, more centralized in terms of decision-making, at least insofar as it impacts the rest of the world. And someday India will join this club. So this is sort of a bit bipolar now, with the anticipation it probably will and surely could be multipolar in the future. But right now, there is a rivalry between China and the United States that has to do with technology, economics, and national security and influence. And all of those dimensions are important. I don't think there's any way you could make this go away. It was inevitable as China grew. What isn't decided, rivalry doesn't mean destructive competition. It means rivalry, right? But the mix of cooperation and competition that's embedded in that rivalry as we go forward is yet to be determined. It could go very badly. We could have an extended trade war. In the extreme case, we could have a kind of economic Cold War in which a whole bunch of countries are forced to choose up sides on this issue. Or you could have competition that's pretty healthy and embedded in cooperation on a whole range of issues: security, cybersecurity, there's climate change, a whole bunch of things where you can not only but need to cooperate. And you have the rise of the emerging economies generally, so you have this challenge of including them in a decision-making process that our institutions aren't designed to accommodate. And then you have this really important thing, which I'm sure you've noticed. Now, people call this different things, but I call it nationalism. So nationalism's always been there, but we have a rising pattern of an aggressive, assertive nationalism pretty much everywhere when I look. And that nationalism is basically directed at the institutions that are global, reasserting national priorities, rejecting elites that supported the kind of globalized institutions. My colleague Danny Roderick said we had a major change in the 90s. The 90s is when we moved from the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is like the United Nations. Everybody has to agree. They haven't agreed on anything yet. Nothing. There is no round of trade and related agreements that have come out of the WTO in its 20-plus year history. It doesn't mean the WTO is unimportant. It is very important for adjudicating trade disputes, and we have no alternative, but it hasn't solved the problem of getting 180 countries of extraordinary diversity in size, income level, challenges, and so on, to come together and agree on stuff. And so that is one of the challenges we face going forward, regardless of whether it's through the WTO or other institutions. And we've seen this rejection of multilateral structures, not completely, and elites. I mean, the striking thing about the politics in most countries is the rejection of traditional parties, right? Traditional governing structures. And finally, you have something that most people don't think about, which is what I call a clash of systems. So the old view was this: the people who believed that the architecture that was created after World War II would survive was based on a premise. And that premise was that as these rising countries that eventually were going to dominate the global economy, as they grew and became wealthier, this is going to sound crude, they'd become like us, right? What does that mean? I mean, they'd be governed like us, right? They would have governments and markets that had a fairly bright line between them, right? That you could tell when something was being subsidized or not, right? A whole bunch of characteristics that we associate with kind of, let's call them the Western democracies. The crude assumption was, as they grew and became wealthier, even though they don't all look like us now, they would look more and more like us, and this rule-based system that we lived in was built initially for that, and then we just made exceptions for small countries as they navigated through the complex process of economic and social development. And now it's pretty clear that assumption's wrong, right? They're not going to look like us. China is going to have a different governance structure, and there's evidence of this and it's already causing problems. So I don't have the time to get to the end of this argument, so let me just tell you, right? One, China's government is much further into the economy, even though it's a market economy, than ours is. It has a big state-owned enterprise sector. Under the current administration, since 2013, the government has become a more intrusive presence in the private sector. This has risks in the Chinese economy that we definitely don't have time, but if you're in Chinese growth, you'd be focused on these, and so on. And so part of the challenge, if you're going to rebuild this system, is to rebuild it in such a way that accommodates, right, a much greater diversity. It's a rule-based system. You have to have rules, or nobody knows what's going on. It's just chaos. But it's a rule-based system that has to accommodate much greater diversity that looks at least semi-permanent, right? That it's not just going to drift away if we pretend it's not there. Nationalism in slightly greater depth. I don't think we understand completely where this is coming from, but I would say the following are contributing factors. There's a lot of smart things written about this, so I don't mean to dismiss it. I just don't think they amount yet to a pretty comprehensive, convincing explanation of this trend that we see. One is the distributional aspects of growth patterns that I tried to show you a bit about. The second I didn't mention, which is, but I think it explains some of the disillusionment with established elites, the governing parties, business, academic, at least economists to some extent, and so on, is this pattern went on for a long time and nothing happened, right? So that's what I mean by the absence of countermeasures. But there are other factors. I think there is a sovereignty issue. There's a deep feeling that people have that the forces that are affecting their lives in a dramatic way come from way outside, including outside the purview of the people they elect to govern them. And so there's a sense of, no, I don't want to live like that. I want to, elect people who have some degree of control over the environment in which, we live, my family, and so on. So I think there's a pulling back associated with that, and then it would be impossible to deny there's an issue with immigration, which I associate with sort of social and cultural identity, at least in part. And finally, there's independence and national security. So if you look at the internet as an example, so the internet's sort of the thing that we use to glue the global economy together in the last 20 or 25 years. And if you asked anybody in this room 15 years ago to describe the internet, they would have said something like, well, a bunch of people I've never met, describe some technical protocols that make it work. But otherwise, it's this big open global thing, right? Largely unregulated. And that would have been an accurate description. That's changing really fast, okay? Because there's an enormous number of challenges that we now realize that are associated with the creation of this big, powerful thing. The one that may surprise you, some of these are familiar to you. There's huge cybersecurity issues, There's the weaponization of various aspects of digital technology. There's the jobs thing that we spent a little time on. Because you live in Europe, the data privacy and security issues and so on. It goes on and on. Early childhood development, cognitive processes. And I don't know, honestly don't know, how, if somebody spends 10 years walking the streets of Padova staring at a screen, what the effect on their mental processes is, and nobody else does either. But there's serious people studying it. That's the good news. But the one that may surprise you is the top one, defense. So this isn't just an economic and social agenda, it's a national security agenda. And the reason is that the military, and especially in the United States and China, have realized and said clearly that falling behind in the digital technologies almost automatically puts you behind in defense capability. And that's something they will not allow to happen. So there is a competition to stay at the forefront of these digital technologies. And it's not surprising. I mean, you know, unless we have treaties, we're very close to have autonomous warfare machines. Some of them will fly, some of them will roll on wheels, some of them will be underwater, and not to mention the artificial intelligence capability of figuring everything out faster than human beings can. Anyway, bottom line is, digital technology has now got a major national security agenda running right through its middle. And you can see this. Huawei is basically blocked into the United States. You can't sell iPhones with AT&T. I mean, not iPhones, mobile phones. It can't buy a company. Ant Financial, which is the financial arm of Alibaba, separate company, tried to buy MoneyGram in the United States, blocked, right? I mean, we're about one step away of blocking people, as well as companies and cross-border investments to move in this direction. Now, you know, we're at the early stages of this, and we may reverse course, but what this is like nothing that we've experienced before. So that's, I think, you know, what we're going to see in the internet is two things. One, much heavier regulation. We're already seeing it. We have the European Initiative, which may become a de facto standard for data privacy and to some extent security in the developed world. So that's one thing. And we're going to probably have to have regulations that have to do with security of data and whatnot that are serious. I mean, we've just had too many breaches, right? Every time you turn around, there's another one. So I won't mention them all, but if you read the newspapers, you know they come one after the other. We're going to have regulations on the Internet of Things. Why? Because 2 years ago, hackers went after the servers that run the mega platforms like Facebook and whatnot with a denial of service attack. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's basically you hit them with so many requests that you bring the servers down. Where was that attack initiated by the hackers? Answer, from the Internet of Things, little cameras that people have all over the place. You know why they initiated there? Because none of those things have any security on them at all, okay? And in the future, that's going to be the pacemaker in your chest, and it's going to be a whole bunch of stuff on autonomous vehicles, and it'll only take one or two of those, right? And then we'll have regulations that cover everything that gets anywhere near the Internet. Otherwise, the system will be way too vulnerable, okay? So you can see, we're at the early stages of this journey, but where we're going. And the other thing is the regulations will be done at the national level primarily, except for Europe, so at the regional level, and they won't be consistent with each other. Why? Because there's different governance and value systems. In China, the reason the mega platforms from America can't go to China is basically not because they're just blocked. I mean, they are blocked in the internet sense, but because they can't accept the rule book in China. So in China, the government, I'm not being critical here. It'll sound like I am to a Western audience. China, you know, the party and the state has the right, with apparent support of the vast majority of Chinese, to screen the content on the internet, including social media. And if they think it's not in the public interest, take it out. And they have the right to see the data. Europe's somewhere in the middle. We have a data privacy law that doesn't look anything like that, at least vis-a-vis, governments. And in the United States, we're just lost. So we know we have an issue with foreign interference. We know we have an issue with polarizing content and stuff like that. But by Constitution, there isn't any entity. There is no entity that is the legal and constitutional right to filter content on the internet. We have no answer to this. So a lot of this is undetermined, but it won't look like 2003. That one is for sure. I think that's most of what I wanted to say to you, except for this, and I'll close on this. In this blizzard of concern about jobs, about these transitions, about distributional patterns of growth, and then all these things to do with the internet, it all sounds pretty negative. But in fact, there's enormous potential for inclusive growth, especially in the developing world. And so I would love to spend more time describing you, but basically it works something like this. If you go to China now, you will discover that e-commerce is more highly developed than anywhere else in the world, with the possible exception of South Korea. And it has a mobile payment system that's increasingly taking over the whole consumer side of the economy. It's not a monopoly. It's Alipay, which is part of Ant Financial, and WeChat Pay, which is part of Tencent, WeChat complex. And there are others, and there probably will be others because it's a big market. And it's AI-driven, and the data is merged with the Alibaba e-commerce platform, which is so the payment system and the other data are merged. And then you turn the AI systems loose on it, and then you realize you can do extraordinary things. So, for example, in most developing economies, there's a huge set of people that are basically out of the modern economy. They don't have any collateral. They don't have any history. They're largely anonymous. Right? They can't borrow from banks, because banks view them as risky, and so they need collateral to borrow, but they don't have any. In these AI-driven systems, you have so much data on what people have done and how reliable they are, you can actually give them a credit score that's more accurate than the credit scores we have in the developed economies, and then you can extend them credit, small amounts initially, no collateral, right? And what you see when you go there is that, then a whole bunch of people with interesting ideas start entering the economy. They can get financing. They start a small business using the e-commerce platform, and so on. And a fair amount of growth and a whole lot of inclusion is developing there. There are bits of this in other places, but it has huge, huge potential. You all know what an ecosystem is, right? You've lived around them. There's one here in Padua. There's one in Silicon Valley. There's another batch in New York, and so on. These are highly productive, innovative collections of things that have the property that a lot of ideas get exchanged easily, and there's infrastructure that supports the creation of new technologies and new businesses and new business models. All they're not different in kind, they're just digitally enabled. And the digital enablement drives the entry barriers down to close to zero cost and the opportunity set up. So I wanted to close with an optimistic message that this has huge potential to generate inclusive growth patterns. Thank you very much for listening to me. How do you want to organize this? So you guys go ahead, and then we'll talk. It's not on.
Sir Michael Spence. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation and the journey that you present us on how, starting from the growth of the population, we arrived to inclusive growth through digitalization and other very interesting topics. So I want to a little bit ask you to elaborate more on this process of convergence between the developed and developing economies, because we have seen from the data that you show us that for a certain point of time, through trade and liberalization, there's been a kind of process of integration between the two sides of the world, and specifically that if we think about China, that China became the factory of the world. But then you show us also that through digitalization, there's a transformation in the way jobs are organized, and also the value is created. So you stress a lot that we are not only considered tradable and non-tradable, but if we will look at the value added, the picture is different. So I want to ask you, what is your really your opinion to elaborate more about that? Because you really stress the difference between manual and cognitive, and we know there's many, report from UNGAT and many other that stress that through digitalization, the developing economies can really cover activities like design, for instance, creativity that was not covered in the past. So this is my question for you.
I've got, if they
okay.
turn it on,
Okay.
that's an excellent question. Gosh, it has many parts. So the intrusion of the digital technologies in the whole process is relatively recent. The first impact of the digital technologies came roughly started in the 1980s, and what it enabled was the construction by multinationals of more complex global supply chains. Basically, if you went way back in time, the old model of trade was you produce it in A and sell it in B. And B was a developed country because that was where the market was, and A was the place that could produce it relatively cheaply, and you were done. If you look at most, supply chains now, although this is, except for this issue you mentioned, they're very complex. If you look at an Apple product, like an iPhone or an iPad, it comes from all over the place. Most of the value, well over half, is created in the United States or in the places where it's marketed, by retail, by marketing, by product design, etc. In terms of manufacturing it, but it's assembled in China, but the parts come from, Taiwan and South Korea and Japan and so on. I mean, we're talking about semiconductors, displays, all kinds of specialized stuff that gets put in that little device. And so those global supply chains look more like networks and not chains and so on. So that's kind of the first impact. And basically, if you look at the developing countries, China would be an example, but coming before it, South Korea, Taiwan, and others, if they didn't have a lot of oil or natural resources, the basic growth model was what's come to be called the Asian growth model, which is when you're poor, you specialize. It by the way, illustrates the Rhetori's point that value in the end is created by people. And Asia is the most resource-poor part of the world. If you asked economists, which, right after World War II, people were supposed to know something about development economists, not people like me, where in the developing world, if there's real progress, where will it occur? And they said Africa. And they said, where will the real trouble be? And they said Asia. Now that's as close to dead wrong as you can get, right? But we now understand why. They overestimated the importance of natural resources as wealth to be transformed into a kind of something that looked like sustainable growth. And Asia didn't have any of that, so they thought, well, they can't jumpstart this process, they'll stay poor. And that turned out to be wrong. So they jump-started it with people. And that growth model was labor-intensive, process-oriented manufacturing assembly, and it still is. And the so-called flying geese model was basically, it's a Japanese scholar who invented this term, basically you don't stay in that state forever, because as your incomes go up, you aren't the low-cost place, and you can see it. Japan used to be low-cost, exited. South Korea and Taiwan exited. China's exiting now. Vietnam's not far away, etc. So the baton is being passed, right? And the conjecture is it goes to Bangladesh and it will go to Africa. Now, there's intervening factors, for sure. The concern now is that the digital technologies will basically, for the low-income, late starters, it will cut off the core of the growth model. Because remember, if you think about this carefully, a poor country has great difficulty growing at high speed on its domestic demand. Why? Because it's small and kind of simple. I mean, most poor countries spend most of the national income on food, shelter, energy, and a few other things. And so you can't get anything that vaguely resembles specialization in the sense Adam Smith meant it. You can't master one thing and then sell to a huge global economy. Every time you master something, you hit the limits of the market on the domestic side. So the growth model, the core of the growth model, is inbound technology transfer and adaptation, right? That's ideas, right, that have been developed somewhere else, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then selling to a huge market. And so that's still valid. The question is, if digital technologies come in, what are they going to sell? My best guess is the middle-income countries, the Chinas of the world, are actually in the sweet spot of this. That is, the digital technologies are net-net a huge positive. You know, they leapfrog things. But if you look at China's digitization, more or less they skipped computers and whatnot and went right to the mobile devices. So the internet and the mobile internet are not quite the same thing, but pretty close in China. If you look at payments, they skipped checks, credit cards, and a bunch of things and went to mobile payment system. And if you go to Shanghai now and ask somebody, where's your wallet? They say, I don't carry it. Because I just pay with my phone. There's a famous, I'll stop with this, there's a famous picture. It's on the internet, if you can find it. It's a beggar, very jolly looking fellow. Doesn't seem to have any legs, but he's sitting on the pavement. And in front of him is a basket, as beggars often have. And there's a couple of bills and a coin in it. And on his chest are the scanning codes for WeChat Pay and Alipay. So that's how beggars work.
Thank you.
So I think there's for people like us who are focused on development, there's a huge set of issues that we're only grappling with. One is this negative one. Do we cut off the growth model for some of the poorer countries in Asia, Africa, mainly? And two, are there alternatives that may not be as powerful but are pretty interesting that look like they generate real inclusive growth energy? And I think the answer to that's yes, based on the China experience, but we got a ways to go.
I wanted to bring you to a slightly different topic that you mentioned in your presentation, which is a concept of distribution. You stressed it. And I was struck by one of the sentences that you made, that we might have oversold globalization. That's a very powerful message that you gave us. So we might have neglected the serious distributional consequences of globalization, so the struggle between those that benefit from globalization and those that did not. Now, in Europe, as you know, we have our cherished welfare systems that have been trying to address these distributional struggles for quite a long time. But the welfare systems, as we know, are insurance mechanisms, and insurance necessarily involves some sort of cross-subsidies, so people that gain and people that lose in these cross-subsidies. Now, these systems are under pressure when you have globalization. So my question, when you have markets, when you have competition, when you have globalization, so my question to you would be, can these systems, this welfare system, address the distributional struggles that we have, given the type of global competition that we're facing? Because the distributional problems are going to be the crucial problems that we have to address in the future, as you have mentioned it several times in your presentation.
Well, I mean, in many ways, I think this is the central question, and it would take anybody with a remarkable lack of humility to claim to know the answer. But I do think experience in Europe tells us that. So my take on Europe is that the social security systems are evolving, and they're evolving fairly rapidly, depending on where you are. And they used to depend a lot on things like employment, where you worked, the permanency of that job. And they're migrating away from that to much more flexible systems in which you protect individuals and families and so on, without lousing up the structural flexibility of the economy. So the reforms in Germany in the second Schroeder administration were a move in that direction, I think. Most people who thought about this and know anything more or less go across countries think that the Nordic countries have made real progress in this. And part of it has been making the social insurance, parts of the social insurance thing, the systems, also part of the structural adjustment system, right? Retraining, reacquiring skills, and so on. Not because of the conditionality, but because people need it. And I think it's not surprising some of the innovation has occurred there. But anyway, as compared with the United Kingdom, and especially the United States, which we are just way, way behind in this, way behind. We don't have good technical training, we call them vocational education schools. We don't have anything like the German or Swiss system for producing people in various categories of work that require apprenticeship systems and training and so on. But I think the Nordic countries got there fast because they're small. And so their tradable sector has to be competitive or the economy will fail. So if you go to Sweden and say, well, maybe we'll just skip this step, digital technology, they say, no, wait a minute, we're not doing that, right? That's, where we live there. If we fall behind there, then our 3 or 4 major sectors where we, participate in the global economy, automotive, certain stuff like that, we'll just lose. So they start with the premise that they've got to embrace these new things and get the productivity gains, and then they move on to. So my last take on this issue is that the places that made the most progress and are put together in such a way that there's a reasonable level of trust and ability to work together that involves business, government, and labor. And where it falls apart is where that trust doesn't exist. Now, it's never a completely trusting system, but so it's a matter of degree. But I think the real uphill battle is when you have a business sector that's treated labor as sort of like any other input and, discardable. That's a terribly difficult legacy to overcome. I think we have some of that in America. Not in every company, but in general, it's a big problem. In this country, I think there's certainly an admirable social security system. Healthcare in the north and other things like that are just striking. But I don't think labor and business trust each other very much. And so I think it's going to be hard to sort of form a joint venture, if you like, to transform the economy at that level and then get the government to help do it. So that's a challenge I think that we share in the sense I live here and an American citizen. But these are really hard issues. I guess the last thing I'll say is I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. All major disruptions caused by technology are followed by a difficult period of adjustment, and they're long periods, right? I mean, the electric motor is my favorite example. It's cited by economic historians all the time. The electric motor transformed manufacturing because the manufacturing facilities were powered by steam engines, and you can't have 16 steam engines in a plant. So the whole plant was built around this steam engine in the middle. And the electric motor you know, you could just throw the steam engine out and put stuff wherever you want it. But it took, you know, probably 3-4 decades before the people in business, the innovators, figured out, well, what are we going to do with this increased degree of flexibility? And I think, you know, not by perfect analogy, but that's kind of the process we're going to be in, adjusting to working with the machines, is, I guess, the way I would describe it.
Thank you. I think we have time just for 1 or 2 questions for the audience. I have a lot of questions for Professor Spencer, but I would like to give you, the third-year students and colleagues, the opportunity to ask. No one? Thank you. Oh, this.
So, Mr. Spence, thank you to be here with us. Your presentation was really good. And I'd like to ask you, in the final... okay. In the final part, we talked about the technology, sorry. And what do you think about the blockchain, which is now being developed? It started off with the Bitcoin, but yeah, the Bitcoin is another thing. The blockchain will be, I think, the future maybe. Sorry for that, but I'm a bit excited because it's not that normal to talk with Nobel every day, so sorry for that. So what do you think about the blockchain and the time it will need to be involved in the normal finance in a war? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and it's getting a lot of attention. So I think blockchain is quite interesting, and so we're in a kind of journey of discovering how to use it. So it has, I think the original idea was that you could sort of, you know, get institutions out of the way, what I call the libertarians, you know, were smitten with this because you could get institutions out of the way and it just all happened automatically. I think that's probably not the most important thing. But the reason it's getting so much attention is that you do have a way of having quite secure transactions, we believe, although, you know, there's more work to be done, whether they're really secure, whether when we get quantum computing they'll be secure. Quantum computing is pretty fast, and it may obsolete a bunch of security systems that we have just because you can do computations that would have taken, you know, hundreds of years to do with conventional things. The other thing that blockchain gives you is a history that's very difficult to tamper with. So you're starting to see it used in the creation of markets and supply chains where people really care for a lot of different reasons, whether they can track where this thing came from. Is it really healthy if it's a food product? You know, where did it actually come from? You know, the label, you can put anything on the label, but with blockchain technology, which records every movement it makes, maybe with the benefit of the Internet of Things, as you know, I mean, scanning things, more sophisticated versions of it. So bottom line is, I think we're in the early stages of experimenting, you know, with blockchain and finding very interesting applications of it. The big financial institutions are interested in it, the central banks are interested in it. I can imagine central banks, you know, transacting with each other, which they do in massive amounts of money, so to speak, using blockchain. It won't bring down the system. Bitcoin, I think, is, you know, at the moment, relatively uninteresting. I mean, so is it a currency? Well, I don't know. If your currency went up and down in value by 300%, you know, in 4 weeks, would you consider it a currency? I do. I consider it a speculative asset at best, and I wouldn't invest in it. So I think that one's kind of a bubble, but not the blockchain. So I think we're going to go down a road and find very interesting uses of blockchain, and we're well on the way in that journey, but not at the end. I think in the press, blockchain and digital so-called currencies, you know, the ones that are traded get mixed up together, and I think it's better It's not that, I mean, they're related because blockchain technology is. This mining for bitcoins is just nonsense. I mean, it was banned on the Stanford University campus because it was about to triple the electric bill for the university. I mean, it's craziness. Could burn every tree on the planet doing Bitcoin. I mean, anyway, enough. I occasionally say something outrageous, so that's one. The other one I said that high-speed algorithmic trading should be banned, as a result of which I've been banned from the financial industries, but anyway.
So thank you very much. I think we can conclude just very short thought and asking you about, since we are here in this very, very beautiful environment and we start talking about, the knowledge. I would just ask you very, very briefly if we can conclude you with, you mentioned the technological change that are the two very important trends that are challenging the future of us and also of the students that are here. That one is migration means a huge impact on the labor market and how we consider human resources on the one hand, and the other, if I might say, you mentioned inclusive growth, so the attention towards social and also environmental kind of goods. So climate change is another challenge. So if you can summarize very briefly your thought about these issues.
Well, yeah, I mean, very briefly, I think, first of all, I think you're all lucky to be in a great university that has the kind of coverage. I mean, I'm used to this because I was at Harvard and Stanford for most of my life, and we had similar characteristics, meaning you've got everything from philosophy to physics to medicine to engineering, to the humanities, literature and history and so on, and I think that's a huge benefit. And I really believe that that one's ability to, thrive and navigate is materially augmented by having contact with all of those disciplines or a significant subset, and having friends that do all these various things, which is a very important source of knowledge. I mean, networks really matter. If you have a friend who does something very different, the fastest way to get up to speed on some of these new things that are happening, if you have a very good friend from university who's a doctor, and another one who's doing artificial intelligence, and a third one, who's interested in, literature and whatnot, it's just, I guess I don't want to make it sound too practical, because it's rewarding, but it is practical as well. I could tell you stories about where networks work and they don't work that I've rumped into the developing world. I believe a lot of innovation comes from people who are curious and want to do something new. And there are then financial incentives sometimes to do that, but they're not, I think, models in my discipline who say the financial incentives are the overwhelmingly important thing are not quite right. However, the incentives have to be, but Schumpeter wasn't wrong. The incentives have to be there to put the capital in to the extent you need capital, because capitalists are different from entrepreneurs and innovators. But I believe a lot of innovation occurs at the boundary of disciplines, right? Where you kind of have a kind of cognitive dissonance, right? So you're seeing a lot of that now maybe in surprising areas. Behavioral economics is a big, important part of economics now, and it was completely missing, 25 years ago when the pioneers started doing it. But psychologists, Danny Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Richard Thaler, who just received the Nobel Prize last year. I mean, this is, in finance and economics, we basically realized that we weren't going to get very far without the psychologists and the sociologists. So what used to be sort of being snide and critical of each other has now become a kind of partnership. And so I think you can do that. And my advice to young people is cover as much ground as you can, because you never know where those things are going to come from. See, you see extraordinary things happening in the application of technology in medicine now. So, at Stanford, the collaboration between engineering and the biomedical sciences is something you just would have been hard to imagine, even 25 years ago. That's where I think it's a hugely interesting, you can make it sound negative, but I think it's a terrific time to be young.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for joining us in this fantastic speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful being here.
Thanks.